This episode of Now This Is Lit is brought to you by Audible. Check the link in the description to get your first Star Wars audiobook free. Everyone loves free things. Click that link. Do it. This show is also brought to you by our patrons. If you want to support the show in a different way, with just $1 a month, you can join our Patreon at patreon.com/StarWarsLitPod. You can get a sticker. You can get access to an exclusive show that we do every month that's wild and chaotic and fun and something you can only get now by becoming a member of the Patreon. There'll be so many more perks very, very soon. But for now, do you want a sticker? Do you want a sticker that has a Now This Is Lit logo? Because it's fantastic and I love them. But I also want to give them away because there's just a stack of stickers on my desk. So if you want one, $1 a month, patreon.com/StarWarsLitPod. A long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. You're listening to Now This Is Lit, a podcast about Star Wars books, the people who make them, and the readers who just can't get enough of them. I'm your host, Meg Dowell. I use she, her pronouns. And the High Republic is heating up once again with another book coming out at the end of this month. But that's at the end of this month. And so I thought, while you're waiting for the next book in the series, I thought I would do an episode guiding you through how to start reading the High Republic, if in fact you're listening and have not done that yet. The High Republic includes a lot of books by a lot of authors, and the more books that come out, the more intimidating it can feel and confusing it can seem for beginners who haven't started the High Republic yet or may have read one random book, what book to start with, and how to get into this publishing initiative that so many readers and fans are excited about. So I'm going to go through the basics of, if you've never read the High Republic, here's how to begin. This is not a comprehensive guide that takes you through everything you need to know. I would love to put one of those together, and at some point I'm sure I will, but I'm not doing that right now. I will also say that this guide, this getting started guide, if you will, does not specifically include comics or kind of tell you how to start reading the comics. When I do a comprehensive guide and when I do more about comics, I will include those because they are important. They do matter. But this, because I don't want to overwhelm you, I don't want to intimidate you further. If you just want to start reading the High Republic, we're going to focus on the books. We're going to focus on the stories that most people are talking about. We will cover everything on the show, and I will do a better job of keeping up with covering comics and all of those things. But for now, we're not going to talk about those. We're going to talk about Light of the Jedi and The Rising Storm and Out of the Shadows. Not specifically in this guide, but books and only books. So if you're waiting for guidance on comics, it's coming. Don't worry. That's just not what you're getting today. If you would like a written version of this Getting Started guide, I have one of those. It's up on the Now This Is Lit Substack. Now, there's a link in the description. I actually did the written and audio guide at the same time for once. New year, new me. Let's go. So you can follow along with that if you want, or listen to this, and then if you want more information, you can go to that after this. It's up to you. So getting started with the High Republic is not as overwhelming and complicated as it may seem, but if you're like in a Barnes & Noble or something and you're just walking past the Star Wars books and you see a bunch of High Republic and you're like, I don't know which one is the first one, that is what this guide is for. If you don't know which one you're supposed to start with, where it falls in the timeline, that is where I'm going to help you out now. As the High Republic timeline stands at the time that I'm recording and releasing this, it begins with Light of the Jedi. This is release order. Begins with Light of the Jedi and ends with the Eye of Darkness, soon to be Escape from Vallow, at the end of January. I realize that this will become outdated, but I will update the newsletter post. I will do my best so that whenever you're listening to this, you know what I'm talking about. I'll start with this. If you're looking at So you may or may not know that the High Republic is actually divided into 3 phases. Think of this in terms of the prequel, original, and sequel trilogies. It follows actually the same kind of format. So phase 1 was published first, comes first. When you get to phase 2, it's kind of like the prequel trilogy. You're going back in the timeline, going backwards a little bit so that you can kind of fill in some information about what happens to get the story to the point where we are at in phase 1. Phase 3 then, much like the sequel trilogy, goes back to continue the story that phase 1 started. There's not as much of a gap in the timeline between phase 1 and phase 3. There's only a year difference from when one ends and the other starts. But that's kind of how it goes. Now, if you're in a Barnes & Noble, we'll go back to that example. I'm not saying you have to shop there, but that's just, I love to go there and look at books, okay? And you're like, I don't know what phase this book is a part of. They made it very easy to figure that out. So, if you're looking at a book from phase 1, let's use Light of the Jedi as an example. Everything on that, we're talking about the spine, the title, it will be gold. The book itself may be gold colored, or there will be gold text on it. Phase 1, gold. Phase 2 is similar, but it's blue. Some of the books are blue, or the text on it will be blue, or the little banner will be blue. So that's how you know that you're in the second phase, the one that goes backwards. In the third phase, everything is black. And it looks haunting, but also beautiful. So there's that. Gold, blue, black. All right, so I've kind of helped you kind of separate those phases. Which phase, though, do you start with? I recommend that you start with phase 1. You can start with phase 2. You can start with convergence. However, you're going to be missing some context. I think you're going to be a little bit confused, and you're not going to have all of the information you might want in order to really appreciate phase 2. It does happen first, technically, in the timeline, but there's a lot of information you're not going to have. You're not going to have attachments to some of the characters, or what the implications of some of those characters and where they may end up later, or what may happen later because of those characters. It's not going to make as much sense. You can understand it. You can appreciate it if you start with phase 2, but I personally recommend that you start with phase 1, and that begins with Light of the Jedi and technically ends with Midnight Horizon, if we're going in timeline order here. Starting with Light of the Jedi will kind of give you, it's kind of like starting with A New Hope. Like, everything that you kind of need to know about, like, where the galaxy is at this point, what the Jedi are doing, who they're up against, and kind of what the major event that happens at the beginning of this book and what it kind of sets up for the rest of the High Republic as a whole. This big event, they call it the Great Disaster, that happens at the beginning of Light of the Jedi, and it kind of sets up the whole thing. And kind of without that, and kind of seeing how your main characters react to that and things like that, it's a really, really good way to start. You don't have to start with phase 1 again, but I highly recommend that you do. And there's something else that I get a lot of questions about, which is, do I have to start with Light of the Jedi, or can I start with a different book in phase 1? I don't recommend starting in the middle of a phase. I don't recommend starting with The Rising Storm, and especially not The Fallen Star. If you're going to start with a phase, I would start with the books at the beginning and kind of read them through in release/timeline order. So every phase, when you're talking about the books, are in pretty much in both release and timeline order. When you get to phase 2, it's not the same timeline, so it gets a little confusing. But if you start with Light of the Jedi and then go through, I do also have, and it's linked in the post that I've linked below, I have a reading order recommendation, both release order and chronological order, so you can look at that to know every single book and where it kind of falls in this timeline. I don't recommend starting with phase 2, you can. I think you're going to be missing a lot, and you're going to want to go back to phase 1 anyway, so I feel like you should start, even though it's not chronological. I know a lot of you want to read chronological. I don't know why. I think a lot of times it doesn't serve the story as well. And in this case, I don't recommend it, but you can if you want to. But I recommend starting with Light of the Jedi, phase 1. Do not start with phase 3. I know the urge to be a chaos demon is strong, but don't do it. You will start phase 3 with the Eye of Darkness, and you will have no idea what's going on. You will not know who these characters are. They don't explain it. They assume at this point that you know who they are. They give some backstory for things that had happened beforehand, but you're not going to be attached to these characters. You're not going to understand why they're hitting certain emotional beats. You're not going to get it. You're going to be confused. You're going to be lost. You're going to have regrets if you start with phase 3. Plus, phase 3 is not even done yet. It just started in November. So don't do that. I know you might want to. Start with not phase 3. Don't do that to yourself. You're not going to enjoy it, and it's going to discourage you from continuing with the rest of the books. And that's not why we're here. Please don't do that. That's a very rare case where I will recommend please do not read something this way. I don't know why you would do that, but you know, you're also your own person, so I don't know. So back to, you know, reading order and chronological order specifically. Again, if you're going to start chronologically, then technically you're going to be starting with Path of Deceit, which, what a book to start with. Again, you could do it. It's just not going to be as good, though. But if you're going to start with release order, you're going to start with, like I said, Light of the Jedi, then move on to A Test of Courage, Into the Dark, and then so on and so forth. The only thing that's will get a little confusing. Let's talk about Tales of Light and Life for a second. This is a short story anthology. This includes stories from all of the Luminous authors, every single one, and it takes place across phases 1 and 2 in the timeline. It actually starts with a character from phase 2 when they're younger, and goes all the way up until a story that occurs right before the start of phase 3. So if you're reading in timeline order, I suppose you could try to figure out which stories fall when into, but you know, if you're doing release order, then you're going to end up reading that in between the end of phase 2 and the start of phase 3. So chronologically, that will get a little difficult. If you want to figure that out, you can. But I think it's best read after you've read, you know, before you read phase 3. So regardless of which phase you read in what order, you kind of get, it's a fun, like, series of stories featuring all the characters that you've met so far, and it's a good lead up to phase 3 without having to have read everything or know everything that's happened. Don't skip it. You'd be tempted to skip Tales of Light and Life because it's a YA short story anthology. Just read it. It's very good. It's very, very good. It's very, very entertaining. At points terrifying. But I do recommend you do that. It's just chronologically, it's all over the place. It's in order chronologically in the book itself, but in terms of, like, if you're trying to read the entire High Republic in a chronological order, you're gonna end up starting with the first story from that, and then having to go read some books. And if you want to do that, I suppose I could help you out. But that's if you're doing chronological order, that's the only thing. I feel like I'm giving you too much information. But again, all of this is written out for you, so hopefully it'll be a little less confusing. All right, so you know kind of where to begin and kind of maybe have an idea at this point of what order you want to read things in. Do you want to start with phase 1? Recommended. Do you want to read in chronological order? Then you won't start with phase 1. It's a whole thing. But I want to move on to one of the most... a question I get a lot when people ask me about books, which they do often because I have answers. So a lot of people ask me if you have to read everything in the High Republic. And I understand why I get asked this question. And it's the same reason I get asked another question that I'm going to also address. The High Republic includes a lot of books, and that's not even including the comics, the manga, everything else that is included in the High Republic Initiative. Even if we're just talking about books, it's a lot. So I understand why people ask me if you have to read everything. And what they're really asking when they're asking this question is, can I just read the adult novels? Or do I also have to read the middle grade, the YA, all that other stuff? And what they really want to know is, can I understand the story without having to read all that? Or can I just skip it and get what I need to out of the adult novels? I'm going to be honest, I don't like this question. As much as I understand where it's coming from, because I know that, you only have so much time and you only have so much of that time that you have to read Star Wars books. I understand that you want to know if you have to read some YA in middle grade. I get it. But the reason I sometimes struggle to answer this question is because there is an answer, but it's not my favorite answer. I'd rather give the other answer. The real answer that I don't like giving, but I have to give, is no, technically, you don't have to read everything. The High Republic Initiative is actually designed so that a lot of stories can function in isolation, right? So if you were just to read, just the middle grade, just the YA, just the adult novels, if you were to just read one thing, you'd follow certain characters, and you'd get kind of where the overall story, you'd get it. You'd understand. Specifically, if you just read the adult novels, let's talk about Phase 1 to answer this question. If you just read Light of the Jedi, The Rising Storm, and The Fallen Star, and that's all you read from Phase 1, the story would have a beginning, middle, and end, literally. You would know where all of the main characters started and ended up. You would know all the setup you needed for the next stories that would come after it. You would get it. The thing is, I don't think you would enjoy it as much if you just read the adult novels. And I understand that, you might want a more condensed, quote-unquote condensed version of the story, which is not really what just reading the adult novels is. It doesn't, summarize everything for you. It's just one perspective on the story and everything that's going on in the galaxy. You really only get what's going on from a smaller set of viewpoints. And I don't think that serves the larger story that the High Republic is telling as well just on its own. Yes, technically, you can just read those 3 and you get Phase 1. You're fine. You know where the story is going. But you don't really get you don't have the full context for everything. You are missing out on some character introductions. You don't really know. By the time you get to the Fallen Star, continuing with the Phase 1 example, there are going to be characters and things and that are woven into this story that you're going to be like, I don't know who that is or why they're important, or I don't get the significance of this death, things like that. And it's not going to hit you as hard. It's not going to be as emotional as it is if you've read not just those 3 books, but the YA and middle grade books that also come along with that. Comics are a whole other thing. Again, we're not going to talk extensively about those in this particular episode. Again, don't have to read them, but the story is so much richer if you do. You don't have to be a completionist here, and you don't have to read everything. And And that's why answering this question is hard. Because you don't have to read everything, but I wish people would. I think the story is so much more impactful when you have not just the perspectives of the characters in the adult novels, but everyone who's involved and what the stakes are for them and why they make the choices that they make. There's something that happens with a character in The Fallen Star who first appears in Into the Dark, which is a YA novel, which a lot of people aren't going to read because it's YA for some reason. Something happens with this character. And if you don't know, like if you miss the introduction of them, if you miss the book in which like it explains, you know, where their loyalties lie, why they care about certain things, who matters to them, what they're willing to sacrifice, what happens to them in The Fallen Star will mean nothing to you. And that's really, really unfortunate because you've missed out on, you know, all of their character development because you didn't read the other books that they appeared in. It's hard. And I know it's hard because it can feel like you're being asked to do homework almost. It can feel like you're being forced to read books you wouldn't normally read. But that's not really it. Because the worry and the implication here is that you're somehow not allowed to enjoy something if you don't enjoy all of it. And this falls into, this like is a similar line of thinking to when you get into things like gatekeeping in fandom. That's where some of this kind of thinking can lead, where you're not a real Star Wars fan if you haven't read all of the books, or you can't like Star Wars books if you haven't read all of the High Republic. That's not it. And I reject that. I do. I think you can read one Star Wars book, or you can like Star Wars books in general, and you're a fan of Star Wars books and you're allowed to like them and you're allowed to talk about them. You don't have to have read everything. But in that, I also don't want to discourage people from reading these stories that are really, really great. Because the problem is in Star Wars publishing, really in publishing in general, but we'll stick to Star Wars specifically. YA and middle grade don't get talked about as much. They kind of get ignored. They kind of get overshadowed by other books, and it's because there's such a stigma for these marketing labels that are young adult and middle grade. Just because a book is marketed toward younger readers or features characters that are younger, it doesn't mean it's less impactful on the story or any less valuable than an adult novel just because it's an adult novel. This is a problem, and I want to invite a panel of people, experts, on to talk about why things like middle grade matter and are important and should be read. We'll get there. We'll get there at some point, but it's hard to say that you don't have to, because the implication then is that like you shouldn't, and that's not it. So that's the very long answer to the question of what can I not read, basically, in order to get what I need to out of the High Republic. And that's you can skip the YA, you can skip the middle grade, but I recommend that you don't. I recommend that you, even if you don't read completely in timeline or release order, I at least recommend that, like, if you just start with the 3 adult novels, that you go back and you also read the other ones. They are important. They add a lot of context. There's a lot of important character work. Like, if you're not reading a Claudia Gray novel, if you're not reading Into the Dark, which is the first High Republic book she writes, before you're reading The Fallen Star, like, you're just missing so much. And I'm sorry that feels like homework to some of you, but they're good stories. And I highly recommend that you don't skip them just because they're not adult novels. These are all just marketing labels. It just because it's not an adult novel doesn't mean you can't read it because you're an adult. That's not what it means. We really, as readers and as champions for these books, really have to work on this. It's obviously, it bothers me because I've been talking about it for way too long, so I will move on. But that is the answer to that question. A lot of you have asked it. I answered it in the most comprehensive way that I apparently know how. So there's one more thing that I'll address in trying to help you start with the High Republic. Which, see, I told you, it's not as complicated as it might seem. There's just, when you see all the books lined up, it looks like a lot. I hope that I'm doing a good enough job in helping you figure this out. By far, the most common question that I get when people are asking me Star Wars book related questions pertaining to the High Republic, I suppose. But this applies outside of the High Republic, but again, sticking to the theme here so I don't go completely off the rails again. People will ask me, is the High Republic worth reading? And I'm assuming that usually those that ask me this have not actually read the High Republic yet, and they're genuinely asking, is this worth my time? Which is a fair question. It's a long series that's getting longer. It has a lot of stories in it. And the reason people ask me this is because they want to know. If I'm going to invest a lot of my time, if I could be using that time reading other books instead of focusing on the High Republic, am I going to have regrets? Is this going to be worth it for me? And that's a fair question because as a reader, you kind of want to make the most use of your time because there are a lot of books out there, a lot of books coming out every week, and it's hard. This is not only the most common High Republic question I get, but also the most difficult question that I try to answer. And it's difficult because as much as I understand why I get asked this question, it's a little bit frustrating when I do have to answer this question over and over and over again. If you want the short, simple answer, that is, in fact, my opinion and my opinion only, is yes. I think the High Republic is worth reading. I think you have the potential to get a lot out of it, regardless of what your favorite things in Star Wars are, what you like reading, etc. And I highly recommend it to everyone. If you have any interest in reading it, I think you should go for it. I think you should pick up Light of the Jedi, see how you like it, and go from there. Many of you listening or reading, many of you listening may not be satisfied with that answer. Yes, I think it's worth reading. That's kind of how I generally answer questions like these on Instagram because I don't have, it would be a lot to type out in a comment every single time someone asks, is this book worth reading or is this series worth reading? But here I have the luxury of elaborating a little bit more, if you will, and you may still not like my answer, but that's fine. I'm gonna give it anyway. What I will say, if you're questioning whether or not the High Republic is worth reading for you, here's what I would do. I would not worry about anyone else's opinion. I would not trust anyone else's opinion. I would not look up random answers on the internet if you want to know if it's worth reading for you, because you're still not going to get the answer that you need. Because the only one who knows whether or not the High Republic series is worth reading is you. And the only way to learn whether or not it's for you is to read it yourself. And I told you, you may not like that answer, but that's the answer. If you really want to form your own opinion about something like this, you have to read it. And I would recommend that you pick up Light of the Jedi and you give it a try. And, you read it and you see how you feel. And you can do two things after that to decide whether or not you think the series is worth reading. You can continue the series. You can keep reading to feed your curiosity if it's still there after you read the first book. Or you can decide, I liked it, but I don't want to continue, and be done with it and go read something else. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with either of those options. One is not better than the other. This is completely up to you how you go about doing this. I recommend that if you want to know, is The High Republic worth reading? Read the first book and decide whether or not you are okay with stopping or continuing. And that's really the only way to know. I can tell you how I feel. I can tell you all of the good things about The High Republic in order to encourage you to read it. But ultimately, my opinion does not matter when you're deciding what is going to work for you. People don't like that because it means you have to do work. But sometimes the only way to get an answer that satisfies you is to figure it out yourself. And I'm not being mean. I'm not like dancing around an answer. I'm being honest. This is how I wish I could respond to everyone who asks me this question, if I had the patience to type this out over and over and over again in Instagram comments every time I'm asked. I think it's worth it. I think it's 100% worth reading every single book in the High Republic. But I don't know you. I know some of you who are listening, but I don't. If you're asking me this question, I don't know your reading preferences. I don't know what you like about Star Wars. I don't know anything about you that could tell me whether or not this series is going to hit your Star Wars pleasure points, let's say. I don't know that about you. I don't know you at all, most likely. So I can't answer this question the way that you want me to. I can't tell you anything other than the opinion I have formed through the experience of reading the books myself. And I have read all of them. Again, not all the comics yet, but the reason I am an authority on this topic is because I've been following the High Republic from the beginning. I've talked to many, not all yet, but many of the High Republic authors. I really think this series has done a lot of important things for publishing, for the Star Wars story as a whole. And I think you should read it, but you don't have to listen to me. That's just the only thing I can do is encourage you to give it a try and see what you think. Start with Light of the Jedi if you want to start from the very beginning. Go on with A Test of Courage, Into the Dark, The Rising Storm, Race to Crash Point Tower. Just keep going if you want to. But the only way to know is to start with the first one. And that is the long answer to that question that a lot of you are not going to like, but that's what I got for you. I hope that this Getting Started guide has been helpful and has answered some of your questions. I know the High Republic can seem intimidating, but if you just start with one book and go one book at a time and, don't worry about catching up to, the new releases. Don't worry about keeping up if, you read a little slower or you don't get the books right away. Depending on how you read, how you get the books, you may not be able to, read them as fast as it seems like everyone else is. And that's okay. Don't worry about that. If you want to experience the High Republic, start with a book and just enjoy it. There will always, for the record, be other readers who will be more than happy to talk with you about all of these books. And, the High Republic started before this show started, so I'd love at some point to go back and have discussions about all the books that we missed talking about. And I'd love to have, more comprehensive conversations about the High Republic and characters and themes. And, there's a lot I want to do on this show, and I don't have, unlimited hours to do that. But I'm going to do my best. And obviously, if you have questions about the High Republic or Star Wars book reading in general that I haven't answered, I offer in a lot of places. Now, I don't make it very hard to find me on the internet. So if you have questions, of course, you are always welcome to ask, and I will do my best to answer or point you to where you can find the answer or someone that can better answer that question for you. If you have a question about Star Wars books that I personally can't answer, I will try to find someone who can answer and bring them on the show, and they can answer the question for you, and we can have a conversation. That's really what I want the show to be, is informational as well as everything else. But again, I will link to the written version of this guide, and linked in that is the recommended High Republic reading order guide that I have on the newsletter as well. If this was helpful to you, feel free to share this episode. That's just one of many ways you can support the show, and that really, really matters, and it's really, really important because, again, a lot of work goes into making the show, and I love doing it, but your support really does mean the world. So thank you for, at the very least, listening and appreciating all that we do here, because we do work very hard, me and my producer. So thank you for supporting, even just by listening. It makes a difference. Now This Is Lit is part of the Faraway Fandom Network. It is produced by Devor Mondum and written, hosted, and edited by me, Jose Jimenez, designer podcast art. You can keep up with the show on the Now This Is Lit Substack and find the show wherever you get your podcasts. All the other ways you can support the show are in the show notes, including the newest way, which is to become a member of our Patreon, where you, just for $1 a month, you can get access to our exclusive show that we have on there. That's once a month. You'll also get a sticker, and there'll be plenty of other perks that you can get. It's only $1. I only ask for $1. There may be future tiers later, but for now, $1 a month. That's it. If you want to support the show with your dollars, which is $1, feel free to do that. But there are other ways to support as well. For more book reviews and Star Wars Book Celebration, follow Star Wars Book Reviews on Instagram and TikTok.